Hey, I'm Patrick from Last Records, and today I'm covering fatal mistakes in the world's deadliest locations. To be honest, there were multiple stories here that almost broke me. From a volunteer rescuer who risked his life to reach a stranded tourist, to man who ignored warning signs and walked near a thermal pool. What happened in the next few seconds is something I genuinely wish I never learned about. It was June 18th, 2016, on a rain-soaked granite stairway carved into the eastern face of the Huangshan Mountains in Anhui Province, China, a place where the stone itself seemed to breathe water that day, and where a man who had spent years running toward danger finally ran out of mountain to stand on. Liren Qiao was 41 years old and worked as a maintenance electrician for a utility cooperative serving 3 villages at the base of the range. He had no formal rescue certification, no specialized gear, and no institutional backing. What he had was 12 years of showing up, to rock slide, to lost hikers, to the kinds of calls that trained teams sometimes reach second. His younger brother had died on a trail in this same range when Liren was 29, slipping off a wet path during a solo hike and not being found for 2 days. After that, neighbors described him as the first vehicle they heard on the road whenever conditions turned bad. He kept a coil of rope and a headlamp in his truck year-round. My personal impression on him reading his background was that he was someone who had made a private calculation about acceptable risk and had never revised it. That morning, he had already been on the mountain for 4 hours before the call came in about the stranded tourist. He was wearing standard hiking boots, the kind with moderate tread, not the sticky rubber soles used by technical climbers. What pains me to know is he likely knew the difference, but he went anyway. The granite stairway, bolted into a cliff along a busy scenic route, had water and sediment streaming across it after 18 hours of rain, with several upper sections showing visible fracture lines from seasonal expansion and contraction. 2 park responders reached the upper landing but paused, citing audible instability in the rock beneath the damaged section. The stranded tourist, a man in his late 50s, clung to a corroded iron railing on a ledge roughly 30 feet below, requiring both arms for a full handhold. At least 2 posts were visibly weakened from years of rust. Liren descended, using a fixed chain bolted to the rock beside the stairway, testing each step carefully. As reports later noted, the chain was heavily oxidized and slick under the rain. He reached the tourist, positioned himself 1 step below, and wrapped an arm across his chest, attempting to guide him upward toward the intact section. The responders called down to advise against descending further, but like I mentioned, Liren chose to continue, aware of the risk. One of the responders above called down for him to hold position, citing a sound, a low, intermittent cracking coming from beneath the slab Liren was standing on. Both witnesses reported the same sequence, a sharp, hollow snap, distinct from the ambient sound of water and shifting grit. The granite slab beneath Liren's boots shifted forward along an existing fracture line that ran the full width of the step. He drove his weight backward into the cliff face and simultaneously pushed the tourist upward with both arms. The tourist's hands caught the iron post above him. Liren's left foot found no surface beneath it. Liren dropped straight, striking a lower rock edge with his right shoulder. The impact rotated his body. His head contacted a second outcrop, approximately 8 feet below the first point of impact. One responder called emergency services within seconds. Weather conditions and terrain access delayed the recovery team's arrival by approximately 3 hours. Liren's body was recovered, lodged between 2 granite formations, roughly 120 feet below the stairway. Death was determined to have occurred rapidly following the several impacts. The tourist was evacuated by stretcher and recovered fully. Frustratingly, I found that there was no mention of the tourist ever thanking his rescuer. Meanwhile, Liren left behind a wife and a daughter who was 11 years old. If you think that's gut-wrenching, this next one made me think, what does it feel like to finally afford one trip after years, only for it to end like this? It was August 4th, 2017, and the light over Lysefjord was framing Preikestolen. That evening, 2 people stepped backward off the edge of a cliff 1,900 feet above a Norwegian fjord while trying to take a photograph. They never saw the picture. Aaron Horvath was 33 and worked a floor shift at a plastics manufacturing plant in a mid-sized city in eastern Slovakia. His wife, Mira, was 31 and worked in the same facility in the textile finishing department. She had bought new clothes for the trip, but kept her everyday sneakers, flat-soled canvas shoes with minimal tread, chosen because she didn't own hiking boots and couldn't justify the cost for a single trip. They were together since they were both 24, and according to their family, the wedding had been postponed 3 times. Once for a broken furnace, once for medical bills, once because the savings account simply hadn't cleared the threshold they'd set. What pains me to know is that friends said the trip was more than a vacation. It's their first experience done purely for themselves, and the first time either had left their home country on their honeymoon to Norway. From what I've read, Preikestolen is a flat-topped cliff in southwestern Norway, rising about 1,982 feet above Lysefjord, with a wide plateau that extends to an unguarded edge. Its glacially smoothed granite surface is partly covered with loose gravel from foot traffic. That time during their trip, there are no guardrails, and the edge drops abruptly. On a clear summer evening, low sun from the west casts long shadows and glare toward the east, making the cliff's edge harder to judge. By early evening, the crowd had thinned. Aaron placed his phone on a flat rock about 6 feet from the edge and activated the self-timer. It shifted on the uneven surface, altering the frame. After resetting it, he and Mira repositioned, repeating the process multiple times while 2 hikers, roughly 30 feet behind, watched. I get his frustration, but each time he walked backward toward the frame position, he did so without turning to look at the ground behind him. The surface where they stood was uneven, with slight incline and patches of loose gravel over the rock. The dry gravel reduced traction, making any backward movement without visual confirmation particularly risky. On the final attempt, Aaron moved back quickly and pulled Mira toward him by her arm to center them in the frame. His left heel contacted a patch of loose gravel over smooth granite. The sole of his shoe, worn at the heel, likely found no purchase. His foot slid backward. His upper body followed the momentum, leaning out over open air before any corrective movement was possible. But that's not even the worst part. His right hand closed around Mira's forearm as he went. The grip was reflexive. She was pulled forward and off balance in the same motion, her flat-soled shoes offering no resistance against the slope. Neither of them had time to separate the fall from what preceded it. The 2 witnesses reported hearing both figures disappear below the plateau edge within 2 to 3 seconds of the initial slip. They could not see the bodies during the descent due to angle and distance. What followed was not a single impact. The witnesses described a sequence of sounds, irregular, spaced, consistent with bodies striking rock ledges during a descent of nearly 1,900 feet, then silence. A nearby hiker called emergency services within minutes. A helicopter search team arrived approximately 45 minutes later, but fading light and the technical difficulty of the terrain below the cliff face prevented recovery that night. Both bodies were located the following morning at the base of the cliff. The coroner's findings indicated that neither survived past the first impact. Their families did not speak to the press, and I fully understand why. The plateau at Preikestolen still remains one of the most photographed locations in Northern Europe, like nothing happened. All right, this next one genuinely gets under my skin because every single person around him told him not to do it, and he did it anyway. It was September 12th, 2015, and the mid-morning heat had already settled across the low-veld scrubland of a national reserve in northeastern South Africa, the kind of stillness that feels borrowed, held only as long as nothing moves first. Darek Miso was 38 years old and worked as manager in Poland. He had saved for the trip for 2 years, and his travel group, assembled through an online adventure forum, later described him as someone who treated caution as a personality flaw in other people. I personally know people like that, and I almost cut them off immediately. He had dismissed the guide's orientation briefing on the first morning and spent the previous 2 days photographing wildlife from distances that made the rest of the group uncomfortable. His belief, stated more than once across the trip, was that unprovoked animal attacks were a myth propagated by liability-minded park authorities. To what I've read about him, he had no formal background in animal behavior, no wilderness training, and no prior experience in predator-heavy ecosystems, so I have no idea why he was so confident. The vehicle had entered a restricted corridor mid-morning, a region of dense bush and dry riverbed that park staff typically moved through without stopping. The safari vehicle had come to a slow stop along the track, with passengers photographing from inside as instructed. One of the other passengers noticed movement in the brush to the right, a flicker, nothing more. Before the guide could react fully, Darek unlatched the rear door and stepped out onto the road, an action the guide immediately tried to stop, shouting for him to stay inside. He was carrying his phone. He walked roughly 15 feet from the vehicle, slightly bent forward, scanning the tree line. The guide ordered him back twice. He did not return. Now this might just be me, but if you've been explicitly warned multiple times and still continued, I wouldn't feel sorry for you. The lioness came out low and fast from the right, covering roughly 25 to 30 feet before anyone in the vehicles processed what was happening. She hit him high in the chest and upper shoulder with her full body weight, and he went straight onto his back. Witnesses described the impact as instantaneous. One moment he was standing, the next he was gone from view. She repositioned within 2 seconds, moving up his torso toward his throat. The clamp was immediate. Darek's right arm came up, and his hand pressed against the side of her skull. Not a strike, more an instinctive push, but the movement lasted only a few seconds before his arm dropped. His legs were visible above the grass. They were moving. The legs slowed over the following 30 seconds. By the 1-minute mark, they had stopped entirely. 2 other lionesses already nearby were drawn in by the disturbance and moved toward the site. The guide radioed park authorities immediately. Rangers arrived in approximately 20 minutes, but Darek was already dead when they reached him. The coroner's report noted that the cause of death was asphyxiation secondary to cervical crush trauma. The part that infuriates me the most is that the lioness was tracked by park rangers the following day and monitored due to concerns about increased human interaction. It wasn't her fault Darek broke the rules. The incident was logged in the park's internal safety records and reported by regional outlets. Now this next one didn't sit right with me, because unlike the last story, it wasn't the victim ignoring the warnings. It was a student 17,000 feet up, and a professor who kept telling everyone it was fine. It was May 22nd, 2014, on the eastern face of a dormant volcanic peak in the Bolivian Andes, where a university field group arrived at a research station sitting just above 17,500 feet, elevation at which oxygen levels are significantly lower than at sea level, placing immediate strain on the body without proper acclimatization. Tomas Irian was 20 and in his second year of a biology degree at a university in La Paz. According to his family's accounts, he had taken medical leave the previous semester for monitored mental health support following sustained bullying in his department. He had returned to classes 4 months before the trip, and friends later told investigators he had been noticeably more engaged since, attending study sessions voluntarily, staying after lectures, and talking openly about finishing his degree. The field trip had been on the syllabus since the semester's first week. He had signed up within days. It was his first overnight trip since coming back. The research station sat on a wind-swept ridge above the snow line, surrounded by pale scree and the remnant ice of a glacier that had been retreating for decades. The group of 14 students and 1 professor had left La Paz at roughly 11,800 feet that same morning, gaining nearly 6,000 feet in under 2 hours without a single rest stop. Shortly after arriving, several students reported headaches and nausea. By mid-afternoon, a classmate noticed Thomas walking with a widening stance, his feet spreading further apart with each step. His speech had slowed. He was seen pausing mid-sentence without completing his thought. I thought that they would be saved when a student raised the group's condition with the professor. but his response was that the symptoms were mild and expected. The hike continued. No pulse oximeters were on hand, no supplemental oxygen, and no satellite communication device. The station was minimally staffed for the season and carried only basic supplies, explaining the absence of emergency oxygen. Thomas staggered near the northern edge of the station path. Witnesses described his steps as lurching, one foot crossing too far in front of the other, his torso listing left. A classmate placed a hand on his arm. Thomas looked at him, but did not respond to his name. He tried to lower himself to the ground and went sideways instead, his left shoulder hitting packed dirt first, his head following without any attempt to brace. Students knelt beside him. His eyes were open and fixed forward. His breathing became audible from several feet away, a wet, rattling quality on each exhale. Observers noted coughing and short, shallow gasps, consistent with severe, high-altitude illness affecting both his breathing and neurological function. His limbs did not move. Pressure applied firmly to his sternum produced no response. No immediate descent was initiated despite the development of these severe neurological and respiratory signs. A student called for emergency assistance on a personal cell phone. My question is this: while this is happening, what is the professor doing? Why is the student the one calling for help? Because of the remote road and elevation, help took over 2 hours. Thomas lost consciousness after 90 minutes and was unresponsive when rescuers arrived. He was pronounced dead before reaching lower ground. The medical examiner ruled the cause entirely environmental, but I think it should have been murder. The university conducted an internal review in the weeks that followed. The report cited inadequate acclimatization planning, the absence of emergency medical equipment, and the decision not to initiate descent when neurological symptoms first became apparent. As if it couldn't get any worse. No criminal charges were filed against faculty or staff. Thomas Irian had been scheduled to present a field report to his class the following month. He had been improving. That report was never given. After that, this is what I kept thinking. How does someone spend years rescuing people and still not make it out when it's their turn? It was January 29th, 2018, on a north-facing backcountry slope in the Daisetsuzan range of central Hokkaido, when a rescue operation became a second burial before the first victim had been extracted. Kenzo Arata was 67 years old and had volunteered with a regional ski patrol organization for over 2 decades. He was a compact, deliberate man, known for staying composed in situations that unraveled newer patrollers, and his grid search technique, developed long before digital transceivers became standard, had been considered among the best on the team. What had not kept pace was his proficiency with the newer generation of digital Avalanche beacons. These devices processed multiple burial signals simultaneously and displayed directional arrows and distance readings on a small screen. Kenzo had completed the required certification 2 seasons earlier, but team members noted he defaulted to older search pattern methods under pressure rather than relying on the multiple burial search mode. During a training session the previous spring, he had remarked that interpreting the directional arrows under stress felt counterintuitive compared with his practiced hand movements. No one escalated it as a formal concern. In January, Daisetsuzan snowpacks can exceed 15 feet. 3 days of wind loaded an 18-inch slab over 200 feet, resting on weak faceted snow at -4 degrees Fahrenheit, prone to fracture with minimal stress. That day, a skier from a guided ski group had triggered a small slab approximately 400 feet above a lower gully and was buried to an estimated 5 feet. Kenzo arrived on scene with 3 other patrollers and immediately switched his beacon to search mode. A fellow rescuer noted afterward that Kenzo paused for roughly 15 seconds at the edge of the burial zone, confirming multiple burial mode and interpreting directional signals. Now, I think the pause was not alarming on its own. What mattered was that no one on the team had completed a full assessment of the slope above the search area before moving onto it. A second rescuer had looked uphill, remarked on the visible convex roll overhead, and did not halt the search. Understandably, the team said that they felt pressure to locate the buried skier quickly and moved despite the risk. Kenzo moved onto the loaded slope. However, he had taken fewer than a dozen steps when a fracture line opened approximately 110 feet above him. Two rescuers standing at the zone's perimeter saw it simultaneously, a sharp horizontal crack propagating outward from center in both directions with a low, hollow concussive thud, immediately followed by the grinding compression of dense snow beginning to move. Kenzo turned to face uphill. The slab hit him at high speed, knocking him forward until he tumbled headfirst into the dense debris. The avalanche ran about 180 feet before leveling, leaving no part of Kenzo or his equipment visible at the surface. The remaining rescuers initiated a beacon search immediately. He was located after approximately 18 minutes, buried under roughly 4.5 feet of compacted snow. His airway was completely obstructed by dense snow. Emergency responders confirmed death at the scene. The cause of death was asphyxiation from airway obstruction and barial compression. The skier who had initially triggered the slab was located shortly after Kenzo, buried beneath roughly 5 feet of dense snow, injured but alive. The remaining members of the guided group had paused uphill during the slide and remained uninjured, though visibly shaken. Now I know for sure that 67-year-old Kenzo would be fine with this outcome.